Fritz Bayerlein stood in what had once been his command post, staring out at a landscape that no longer looked like Earth. The fields of Normandy had been transformed into something alien, a vast, smoking wasteland of shattered trees, overturned vehicles, and craters so deep they swallowed entire tanks. It was July 25, 1944, and moments earlier, waves of American bombers had passed overhead, unloading their destructive cargo with mechanical precision. In minutes, Bayerlein's elite Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in Germany, had been reduced to rubble. Men lay buried in collapsed bunkers. Tanks burned where they had stood. The ground itself seemed to tremble with the echo of explosions. Bayerlein, a veteran commander hardened by years of war, could only stare in disbelief. He had fought the British across the deserts of North Africa. He had served under Rommel at El Alamein. He knew what it meant to face a disciplined, methodical enemy. He understood how to read their movements, how to anticipate their attacks, how to prepare defenses that could blunt their advance. But what had just happened in Normandy was something entirely different. This was not a battle. It was annihilation. For every Panther his crews destroyed, 2 more Shermans seemed to appear. When his tanks attempted to reposition, American fighter bombers descended from the sky, turning armored vehicles into blazing coffins. His men had coined a grim term for what the Americans brought to the battlefield: Materialschlacht, the Battle of Material. It was a kind of warfare no German manual had prepared them for, where survival depended less on tactics and more on enduring an endless storm of steel. By the summer of 1944, German commanders in France faced 2 Western enemies who, on paper, looked similar. Both had tanks. Both had artillery. Both sought to break out of Normandy and drive into the heart of Germany. But in reality, they fought in profoundly different ways. The British were deliberate, professional, and predictable. Their attacks followed patterns that German officers had learned to recognize after years of fighting in North Africa and Italy. The Americans, by contrast, were chaotic, relentless, and backed by an industrial machine that seemed capable of replacing any loss overnight. German commanders respected the British. They understood them. They had developed ways to counter their methods. But the Americans inspired fear. And that difference would shape the fate of the war in the West. To German officers, the British way of war resembled a methodical sledgehammer. Every offensive was a carefully prepared set-piece battle. First came the artillery, immense barrages that could last for hours, pulverizing German forward positions with terrifying accuracy. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured the thunder of Soviet guns, claimed they could sleep through Russian shelling. British fire was different. It was precise. It was relentless. It gnawed at nerves, breaking men long before the first tank appeared. Then came the armor, hundreds of tanks advancing in formation, rolling forward behind a curtain of exploding shells. Yet, for all their power, British attacks had a rhythm. After advancing several miles, they would halt. They would consolidate their gains, secure their flanks, and bring up supplies. Hans von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Panzer Division, noticed something almost ritualistic about British operations. By mid-afternoon, their advance would slow, then stop. His men joked that the British paused to brew tea. In reality, it was doctrine. The British were cautious, methodical, and unwilling to overextend themselves. And in that caution lay their vulnerability. German commanders learned to exploit this predictability with a tactic known as the backhand blow. The concept was deceptively simple. When the British attacked, German commanders would resist the urge to commit their armored reserves immediately. Instead, they allowed the British to advance, to expend their momentum against prepared defenses. Then, just as the British paused to reorganize, the Germans would strike. Panzer divisions, held back for this precise moment, would launch fierce counterattacks, slamming into exposed flanks and disrupting supply lines. It required extraordinary nerve. Watching frontline units bend and sometimes break while holding back your strongest forces felt like madness. But against the British, it worked. The enemy would gain ground, only to lose much of it again in the counterstroke. The front would stabilize, and the deadly cycle would repeat. Operation Goodwood, launched on July 18, 1944, would demonstrate this doctrine with brutal clarity. The British unleashed their largest armored offensive of the Normandy campaign, hurling over 1,000 tanks from 3 armored divisions against German positions southeast of Caen. 2,000 bombers roared overhead, flattening the German forward line. It seemed unstoppable. The first defenses vanished under the bombardment, and British tanks surged forward. For a moment, it appeared that a breakthrough was inevitable. Then the advance slowed. German anti-tank guns, positioned in depth, began picking off British armor. Concealed 88mm guns, untouched by the bombing, opened fire. Tanks burned across the open fields. When German panzer units counterattacked, the British pulled back. In 3 days, they lost more than 300 tanks, and the front line barely shifted. For German commanders, it was grim confirmation that the backhand blow still worked. Then, just days later, the Americans struck. On July 25, Operation Cobra erupted along the western edge of the Normandy front. Like the British, the Americans began with massive aerial bombardment. Carpet bombing tore apart German positions, burying entire units beneath collapsing earth. Bayerlein himself was thrown to the ground as his headquarters disintegrated around him. But what followed was unlike anything German commanders had experienced. The American tanks did not pause after breaking through. They kept going, and going, and going. On August 1st, George Patton's Third Army surged into action. Within days, American armored columns were racing across France at a speed that stunned and paralyzed German command. Patton did not consolidate. He did not secure his flanks. His orders were simple: bypass resistance, keep moving, and let follow-up forces deal with whatever remained behind. German commanders waited, confident that the Americans would eventually pause, that the moment for the backhand blow would arrive. It never did. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, later explained why American armor was so difficult to fight. To the Germans, Patton was the most aggressive commander they faced. He fought more like a German panzer general than any other Allied leader. He took risks. He seized fleeting opportunities. He moved faster than German decision-making could keep up. His units appeared where intelligence said they could not possibly be. Tanks reached key crossroads before German commanders even realized a breakthrough had occurred. The traditional German counterattack doctrine assumed the enemy would pause. Patton's doctrine explicitly forbade pausing. And above all this loomed the constant presence of American fighter bombers. German soldiers called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber. P-47 Thunderbolts and other aircraft dominated the skies over France, circling endlessly, hunting anything that moved. Their presence inflicted a deep psychological toll. Tank crews developed permanent stiff necks from constantly scanning the sky. The distant hum of an engine meant danger. It meant the hunt had begun, and they were the prey. Columns that attempted to move by day were quickly spotted. Within minutes, aircraft would dive, unleashing rockets, bombs, and streams of machine gun fire. Roads became graveyards of burning vehicles. This air dominance shattered the German ability to counterattack. The backhand blow required rapid movement of armored reserves. But movement now meant death. German tanks hid beneath trees and camouflage nets, waiting for darkness. By the time night fell and they could move, American forces had already advanced another 20 miles. Unlike the British, American air power was tightly integrated with ground operations. Tank commanders could call in air strikes almost instantly. Even when German gunners succeeded in destroying American tanks, it seemed meaningless. German officers noticed something profoundly demoralizing. The tanks they destroyed kept coming back. A Panther knocked out in battle was often a total loss. Germany lacked recovery vehicles. Spare parts were scarce. Once the front moved, any damaged tank left behind was gone forever. American recovery crews worked differently. They moved onto battlefields while fighting still raged, dragging damaged Shermans back to repair depots. Tanks hit in the morning were often back in action by the next day. Crews who survived destroyed vehicles were reassigned within hours. German commanders felt as though they were fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more appeared. Victory lost its meaning. Bayerlein witnessed this firsthand. His Panthers destroyed American tanks, yet the Americans always had more. They never stopped coming. In his post-war interrogations, he said that Operation Cobra had annihilated Panzer Lehr. Not defeated it. Annihilated it. The bombing had turned his positions into a moonscape. Tanks were flipped upside down by blast waves. Crews died without ever seeing the enemy. Then the American armor surged through in a flood that overwhelmed every defensive line. This was Materialschlacht in its purest form, where industrial output mattered more than tactical brilliance. By mid-August, the German position in Normandy collapsed entirely. American forces swept around the flank while British and Canadian troops pressed from the north. The German 7th Army became trapped in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. The only escape was a narrow corridor that Allied forces were racing to close. German columns clogged the roads, desperate to flee. American aircraft attacked without mercy. Artillery pounded every route. From the air, pilots claimed they could smell death. On the ground, twisted steel and swollen corpses formed a landscape of horror. Between 10 and 15,000 German soldiers died. Another 50,000 were captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Those who escaped emerged as shattered remnants, not fighting formations. The Wehrmacht in France had been broken. After the war, Hans von Luck reflected on his experiences fighting both the British and the Americans. He respected the British, calling them professional and gentlemanly soldiers. They fought hard, but within limits he could understand. The Americans, he wrote, were different. Less polished tactically, perhaps, but overwhelming in material and relentless in aggression. Their willingness to take risks, to push forward even with exposed flanks, made them unpredictable. Another German officer, Friedrich von Mellenthin, compared all three major enemies. The British were cautious professionals. The Russians were an unpredictable mass. The Americans combined vast material superiority with aggression that erased German tactical advantages. German doctrine had answers for the British. It had no answers for what the Americans brought. In the end, German commanders did not fear the Sherman tank itself. They feared what it represented: endless replacements, constant air cover, and a logistical system capable of sustaining advances across entire continents. By 1945, German officers on the Western Front no longer hoped to defeat American forces. They hoped only to delay them, trading space for time that Germany no longer possessed. The methodical sledgehammer could be survived. But the American swarm could only be endured.